The dog was going to kill someone. That was the consensus in Bay 3 of St. Agatha Regional Medical Center at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November. Not spoken aloud, because nobody wanted to be the one standing in the hallway of a trauma ward saying something that ridiculous out loud, something that sounded like a line from a film rather than a clinical situation. But the thought moved through the assembled staff the way smoke moves through a structure fire, quiet, low, finding every gap between the things nobody was saying, spreading not by speech but by the particular way that people in high-stakes environments communicate without words, by the angle of a shoulder, by where they were standing in relation to the door, by what they were looking at, and how often they looked away. The dog sat in the corner of Bay 3 pressed against the cardiac monitor wall with his back to the equipment and his chest to the room, and he watched everything. He was a Belgian Malinois, 62 pounds of contracted muscle and scar tissue, and the particular density of an animal that has been forged by training into something that does not exist anywhere in nature, something that bridges the gap between the instinctual and the deliberate, in a way that makes civilian eyes uncertain about what they are looking at. He had not moved or made a sound in the 28 minutes since the medevac crew had brought him in, strapped to the same gurney as his handler, transferred in the particular urgent controlled chaos of a rooftop landing at 11:19, the helicopter gone back into the dark over the highway before anyone on the trauma team had finished reading the transfer sheet. His name, according to the transfer paperwork that nobody had fully processed yet, was Kilo. His handler's name was Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes, United States Navy, and his handler was in the bed in Bay 3 with a left-sided hemothorax and a cracked orbital socket and blood pressure that kept doing things it was not supposed to do, things that made the attending physician's face go careful and still in the way that faces go careful and still when they are running numbers in their head that they do not want to say out loud. The paperwork listed Daniel Reyes's condition in the clipped language of military medicine: thoracic trauma, blast overpressure exposure, loss of consciousness intermittent, and hemodynamically unstable on arrival, and said very little else. What it did not say, and what no one in Bay 3 had yet figured out, was what Kilo had been through in the 22 hours before the helicopter landed on the roof. What it did not say was why a military working dog had a 3-inch laceration along his left flank that someone had packed with combat gauze in the field and never had time to properly treat. What it did not say was that Kilo had not eaten in 31 hours, had not slept in longer than that, and had watched his handler go into cardiac arrest twice in the preceding 6 hours and come back both times, and he, Kilo, had pressed his body against Daniel Reyes's leg through both of those events and had not moved a centimeter and had not made a sound. And it was this, more than any formal training, more than any protocol, that explained what he was now doing in the corner of Bay 3. He was the only protection his handler had ever had that had never failed him, and he was not going to fail him now. The attending physician was Dr. Marcus Fenn. He was 44 years old and had been practicing emergency medicine for 16 years and had treated gunshot wound patients and blast trauma patients and multi-vehicle accident patients and pediatric drowning patients, and he had, in those 16 years, handled things that would have ended careers less built on the particular internal architecture of a person who has decided that what happens in front of them is what they are responsible for, and everything else is something they can examine later. He had exactly zero experience with military working dogs. He stood at the edge of Bay 3 with his arms crossed and his face doing something measured and professional, and said to no one in particular, "Someone call animal control." The words came out as a statement, but landed as a question, because even as he said them, he was looking at the dog, and the dog was looking at him, and the dog was not moving, not lunging, not making the kinds of sounds that would make this situation simpler. The dog was watching, and there was something in that quality of watching, something organized and patient and irrevocably decided, that made Fenn's professional vocabulary feel slightly insufficient to the moment. The charge nurse, a compact man named Phil, who had been working the overnight at St. Agatha for 14 years and who had the particular stillness of someone who has been in loud rooms for a very long time and learned that the loudest person in a room is rarely the most useful one, said, Animal control is 45 minutes out at this hour, and this dog has not actually bitten anyone, Fenn said. Yet? Phil said nothing. The dog watched them both from the corner. They had tried 5 times in the preceding 28 minutes to approach Daniel Reyes. The respiratory therapist, a young woman named Keegan with 3 years on the unit, had gotten within 4 feet before Kilo stood up. Not lunged, not growled, just stood, slowly and with a precision that was more frightening than any lunge would have been, because a lunge is reactive and a slow stand is a decision. And she had stepped back, and Kilo had sat back down, and returned to watching the room with the same quality of attention he had been bringing to it all along. The first-year resident, a young man named Calloway, who had not yet learned which things to be afraid of, and was still in the portion of his training where confidence was outrunning competence by a margin that he could not yet perceive, had tried to reach past the dog to adjust the IV line, and Kilo had turned his head and shown exactly 4 teeth, not quickly, not with anything that could be fairly called aggression in the dramatic sense, but with the deliberate economy of an animal that has been trained to communicate degrees of intent in graduated and unambiguous signals, and Calloway had retreated to the hallway and had not come back. The third attempt involved Phil himself, moving slowly, speaking softly, which was the approach that worked with most animals in distress, and worked with exactly none of the things Kilo was, because Kilo was not in distress in the ordinary sense of that word. Kilo was in a state of focused operational readiness, which looks from the outside a great deal like distress but is a profoundly different internal condition, and Phil's slow movements and soft voice did not provide the signal that would resolve it. The fourth attempt. The fifth. All variations on the same outcome. Kilo sat between Daniel Reyes and everyone who tried to reach him, and he did not move, and he did not sleep, and the cardiac monitor beeped its steady bleep of 11:23 a minute, which was not great but was not the immediate crisis. The crisis was the hemothorax. The crisis was what blood pressure was doing versus what it needed to do. The crisis was that this man was not getting the care he needed because his dog would not allow access, and no one in the building had a language that the dog recognized as safe. If this story is already reaching something in you, if you understand somewhere in your chest what it means to watch something that loyal and that broken and that precise do its job in a place it was never designed to be, hit the subscribe button right now. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from, because where this goes from here is something I'm still working on finding adequate words for, and I've been trying to find them since I first heard this story told. Her name was Nadia Torres. She was 31 years old and 5 feet 4 inches, and she wore her dark hair in a braid, and her scrubs were the color of old pine needles, and she carried a cold cup of coffee from approximately 9:30 until the end of every night shift, because she always forgot to go back for the hot one. She had been a night shift nurse at St. Agatha Regional for 3 years, and before that she had done her clinical rotations at a Veterans Administration hospital outside San Antonio, Texas, and before that she had grown up in a house in Corpus Christi, Texas, where her uncle Ramon came home from 2 tours overseas wearing a face that did not match the one that had left. And she had learned, young, in the way that children learn the things their families teach without intending to teach them. The difference between the kind of quiet that means peace and the kind of quiet that means a person is holding themselves together by force of will alone, and has been doing it for so long that they have stopped noticing the effort it requires. She had a reputation among the night staff for being thorough and patient and somewhat difficult to read and entirely unflappable, which was a quality that the overnight shift at a regional trauma center valued enormously and almost never discussed directly, because discussing it directly would mean acknowledging that some situations genuinely required a quality that not everyone possessed, and that acknowledgement made people uncomfortable in the particular way that comparisons make people uncomfortable in close professional quarters. She was good at the work in the way that some people are good at it, that goes beyond the technical competency, that lives in how she moved in a room, how she read what a room needed from her before the room had finished telling her. She was not assigned to Bay 3. Bay 3 was Dr. Fenn's room, and Dr. Fenn had communicated with the specific nonverbal fluency of a senior physician who has spent 16 years establishing what his nonverbal communications mean, that nursing input on the management of the current situation was not being solicited. She was passing the hallway window on her way to check a patient in Bay 7 when she stopped. She stood at the glass for a moment. Inside Bay 3, Dr. Fenn was on his phone with his back to the patient, almost certainly doing the math on 45 minutes versus blood pressure numbers, and doing the math on the administrative complications of a military working dog in a civilian trauma bay, and what that required in terms of chain of command, and whose problem it technically was. Kilo sat in the corner with his chin up and his eyes on the door, doing what he had been doing for 28 minutes, which was exactly this and nothing else. Watching. Deciding. Nadia Torres looked at the dog for 8 seconds. Then she looked at Daniel Reyes for 3 more. His lips were moving, barely in the shallow way that a person moves their lips when they are most of the way unconscious and still fighting their way back toward something, still reaching for a tether in a dark that has gotten very close and very heavy. She read his lips. Not perfectly, not every word. Enough. She opened the door to Bay 3 and she walked in alone. She walked in slowly, without hurry, without the careful, exaggerated, slow motion of someone trying to telegraph harmlessness to an animal, which is itself a signal that animals read as anxiety, as performance, as the scent of someone who is frightened and trying to hide it. She walked in the way she walked into any room, which was with her weight evenly distributed, and her hands loose at her sides, and her attention fully present, and her body not performing any particular version of itself. She walked in like someone who belonged there, not because she was pretending to belong, but because she had decided that she did. And there is a difference between those two things that a trained working dog can always read and will always respond to. Kilo stood up. She stopped. She did not step back. She stood still in the middle of the bay with the cardiac monitor behind her and Daniel Reyes between her and the dog, and she let the room be what it was. The cardiac monitor beeped. 11:21 a minute. The ventilation system pushed air through the ceiling vents. Somewhere in the wall, something was vibrating at a low, even frequency that you would only notice if you were very still. She was very still. She looked at Kilo, and she did not look away, and she did not advance, and she breathed at a rate that was, without deliberate effort, the slow, measured rate of someone who is not afraid, because she was not afraid in the ordinary sense of that word. She was in the same condition she was in during any moment of professional uncertainty, which was focused and present and doing the continuous real-time reassessment of what the situation was and what it needed from her. Kilo stood and looked at her. His ears were forward, his tail was not moving, his weight was distributed forward on his front feet in the way that a working dog distributes weight when it is assessing whether to act, and the assessment was ongoing, and the outcome was not yet determined, and the room was completely still. Then, slowly, Nadia Torres crouched down, not all the way to the floor. A 3/4 crouch, knees bent, weight low, hands loose and visible at her sides. The posture of someone who is not planning to move quickly in any direction, who's not trying to seem larger than they are, who is offering a profile that is smaller and lower and less threatening without the exaggerated submissiveness that working dogs rate as manipulation. She looked at the floor in front of Kilo, not at his face. She let him look at her without returning the look in a way that could be read as challenge, and she said something. Quietly, in a voice that Phil, who had materialized at the hallway window, could not hear through the glass. She said something, and then she was still. And then she said something else, and then she stopped talking entirely and she was quiet. And she waited, and the room was very still, and the cardiac monitor beeped its 11:21, and the ventilation system pushed its air, and the walls vibrated at their low frequency, and nothing else happened for a moment that was longer than it had any right to be. Kilo sat down. The hallway outside Bay 3 became, without anyone making a decision about it, crowded. Phil was at the window with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it did when he was processing something he did not have a category for yet. Calloway was against the far wall with his arms crossed in the specific expression of a first-year resident who has just witnessed something that his training has not yet given him a framework for. Keegan, the respiratory therapist, had drifted back from wherever she had been and was standing 2 feet behind Phil. 3 other nurses from adjacent bays had arrived in the way that people in hospitals arrive at things, drawn by the alteration in the atmospheric pressure of the corridor that signals that something significant is happening in a specific room, the way animals know something is happening in a specific part of the forest. Dr. Fenn had let his phone call go quiet. 6 or 7 people stood in a hallway in the particular silence that happens when the world is doing something that everyone present knows is significant, and no one present has a framework for yet. The framework will come later. Right now there is only the thing itself, unfolding in real time through a pane of glass, and it is enough to stand and watch. Kilo sat down. Nadia Torres rose, slowly, to standing. She took 1 step toward Daniel Reyes. Kilo watched her. She took another step. Kilo watched her. She reached the side of the bed and she picked up Daniel Reyes' wrist and she took his pulse manually, with her fingers on his skin, which was not the most efficient way to assess pulse when there was a cardiac monitor reading it continuously and displaying it above the bed, but which was the right thing to do in that moment in a way that bypassed the technical and landed somewhere older, in the language of presence and contact that precedes medicine and underlies it, and is what medicine is trying to approximate when it is working correctly. Kilo watched her take his handler's pulse. The dog did not stand. The dog did not show his teeth. The dog did not move. In the hallway, Dr. Marcus Fenn put his phone in his pocket. He stood at the window for a moment with his arms at his sides in a posture that was noticeably different from his standard posture, more open, less defended. Then he walked to the door of Bay 3, and he opened it, and he stepped inside carefully, watching Kilo, moving with the controlled deliberateness of someone who has just understood that the physics of this room have been changed by someone else and is now navigating within that change. Kilo looked at him. Kilo looked at Nadia. Kilo looked at Fenn again. The assessment was ongoing. The outcome was different now than it would have been 8 minutes ago. Something in the room had shifted in a way that was real and measurable. The dog had granted conditional access, not because the threat was eliminated, but because the specific signal he had been waiting for had arrived, and the signal had come from this woman, and she was still here. And as long as she was here, the room was, in some register that Kilo's training and his animal brain had agreed upon together over 6 years of work in difficult places, manageable. Fenn moved to the opposite side of the bed and picked up the chart and said, in a voice that was quieter than his standard operating volume by approximately 40%, "What did you say to him?" Not quite a question. The outside of it was acknowledgement. The inside was the question. Nadia said, "I'll tell you later." Fenn looked at her for a moment, making the specific face of a physician, deciding that this moment is not the correct moment for the conversation he wants to have, that there is something in front of him that has priority, which there is. He said, "All right." And they worked. The next 40 minutes were, in the technical language of the trauma team, productive. Productive meaning. The hemothorax received a chest tube, and Daniel Reyes's oxygen saturation climbed from 84% to 96% inside 18 minutes, a change that Fenn felt in his shoulders the way physicians feel the critical numbers coming right, a physical release of tension that he would not have been able to describe if asked, but that was completely real, and that everyone in the room could feel the moment it happened. Productive meaning. The orbital fracture received proper documentation and the neurology consult was paged and acknowledged. Productive meaning the blood pressure found a steadier rhythm and stayed there. Or productive meaning. All of this happened in a room with a 62-pound Belgian Malinois sitting in the corner watching every person in the room with an attention that never wavered and a stillness that never broke, and a set of teeth that stayed behind closed lips, because Nadia Torres was in the room and she had said something that the dog understood, and as long as she was in the room, the conditional access held. Through the chest tube and the neurological assessment and the blood pressure corrections, Kilo did not take his eyes off her. Not once. Not for a second. He watched her the way a dog watches the person he has decided is the anchor point in an environment that has recently and repeatedly demonstrated its capacity for violence, and in that watching there was something that was not comfortable to look at directly. Something that carried in it all of what he had been through in the 31 hours before the helicopter landed, all of what Daniel Reyes had been through, all of what they had been to each other in the places they had been together. And it was not nothing. It was not small. It was enormous in the way that loyalty between a person and an animal who have kept each other alive in difficult places is always enormous, quietly and without ceremony, without words. If you've ever watched someone who was supposed to be impossible to reach just reach, if you've ever been in the room when the locked thing opened because someone had the right key and they didn't know they had it until the moment they used it, subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with someone who works the night shift. Drop a comment. This community is built from the people who stay in rooms, and I want to find all of you. What had happened to Daniel Reyes and Kilo happened, as these things tend to, in layers that came off slowly in the days that followed, like dressings from a wound, each layer revealing a different depth of what lay beneath and requiring a new assessment of how deep it went. The official account, the one that would eventually appear in the paperwork filed with the Department of Defense and the various after-action reports and the records that Nadia would never see, was spare and technical and described events in the passive voice that military bureaucracy uses when it is uncomfortable with what it is describing. When the language of process and procedure is being used to hold at a careful distance something that resists being processed or filed or managed. The unofficial account, the one that the medevac nurse had given in the 30-second handoff on the rooftop bay before the helicopter went back into the dark, was shorter and more honest. Training operation that went sideways in the specific way that operations go sideways in specific environments with specific risks. An improvised explosive device, which is a phrase that carries its weight in the particular way that phrases carry weight when they have replaced longer and worse descriptions of actual events. A blast radius. Daniel Reyes had been outside the worst of it, but not far enough outside it. Kilo had been closer because Kilo had been ahead, because that was what Kilo did, which was move ahead and clear and come back and move ahead again, the rhythm of his work that had become the rhythm of both of their lives over 6 years of working together in the places they went. The blast had thrown Kilo into a concrete barrier. The barrier had returned him to the ground. Daniel Reyes had reached his dog before the dust had fully settled, before the rest of the team had re-established their bearings, before anyone had assessed his own condition and catalogued his own damage. Because that was the kind of person Daniel Reyes was, the kind of person about whom the people who work with him say, quietly, when he is not in the room, that they would follow him into anything. Which is the highest professional currency available in environments where following someone into something is not a metaphor and the stakes of the assessment are absolute. This was the context that the paperwork did not carry and that Nadia Torres had understood, if not in its specifics, then in its shape, in the 30 seconds she spent at the hallway window reading the room through the glass before she walked through the door. Context mattered. She understood this in the particular way that people understand things they have absorbed not from formal study, but from prolonged proximity to a specific kind of human experience, the kind that sits in the body and changes it and is not accessible through any other route. Her uncle Ramon had not talked about his time overseas, not to her, not to her parents, not to anyone she was aware of. But she had watched him live in his body after he came home. The way he moved through rooms, the way he sat with his back to walls and his face to the door, the way his dog, a large, undifferentiated mutt named Sergeant that he had adopted from a county shelter in the first year after he got back, a dog with uncertain parentage and certain character, was the only living thing that could walk up behind Ramon without making him flinch. She understood something about the relationship between a veteran and a dog that had kept them functional. She understood it not analytically but somatically, in her chest, in the recognition that lives in the body as a knowledge before it lives in the mind as a proposition. This was what she brought into Bay 3. Not a technique extracted from a manual, not a protocol she had been certified in and could show documentation for. Something older and more specific than either of those things, something that had the particular texture of knowledge that lives in a person who chose to stay in a room when staying was optional and leaving would have been entirely defensible. Kilo had a history that no one at St. Agatha Regional had access to, and that most of them would not have known how to read if they had. What they had access to was behavior, and the behavior was not mysterious to anyone who had ever sat in sustained proximity with a person who was keeping themselves together by force of will at the absolute edge of their capacity. 62 pounds of trained muscle and conditioned response, and the particular hypervigilance of an animal who has decided, at some cellular level, that he is the last reliable defense between his handler and a world that has recently and repeatedly demonstrated its capacity for sudden and overwhelming violence. He was not being aggressive. Aggression implies something undirected, something that erupts before the decision has been made. Kilo was something else. Kilo was precise, and precision in a frightened working dog is not safer than aggression. It is more dangerous, because it means the dog is making calculations rather than reacting, and a dog that is making calculations has already determined what it will do and is only waiting for the correct input from the environment to execute that determination. The correct input, the specific environmental signal that would have crossed whatever operational threshold Kilo had established, was never formally identified after the fact. This became a topic of conversation in the days that followed, in the break room, in the parking garage, in the nurse's station at 2 a.m. when the shift was quiet, and the thing that had happened was still sitting in everyone's chest, unprocessed. What did she say? How did she know to say it? What was the threshold, and how close did they come to crossing it? The answer to the last question, which was the most important question, was uncomfortable in the way that the most important answers usually are, closer than anyone wanted to think about. The distance between what happened and what almost happened was measurable in seconds, and a posture and a tone of voice and words that only one person in the building had any reason to know. What Nadia had said to Kilo became the question, circulating through the night shift like a slow current, asked by everyone in different registers and at different times, and for different reasons. Phil asked directly in the medication room at 1:15 when the acute crisis had resolved into a sustained, careful management and there was room to breathe. Calloway asked with the eagerness of someone who wanted to understand a thing that had surprised him, because being surprised bothered him and he preferred the world to be explicable. Keegan asked twice. A traveling nurse named Simone, who had not been in the hallway but had heard about what happened in the break room at 3 a.m, the way information moves through night shifts by a kind of osmosis, by the pressure of the extraordinary pushing through the ordinary membrane, she asked. Dr. Fenn asked again, more directly. At 1:30 in the medication room, after his charts were current and his immediate clinical obligations were discharged, and the question had been sitting with him long enough to become specific and to stop feeling like curiosity, and to start feeling like something he needed to understand. Nadia told him some of it. She said she had received brief and informal training in basic military working dog handler protocols during her VA rotation in San Antonio, and that part of that context had included an overview of how military working dogs were typically cued and how a handler communicates intent and safety to an animal in a high-stress environment where normal communication is compromised. She said she had used a variation of the standard verbal stand-down cue, which was not classified and was not a secret, but which was also not something that a civilian trauma nurse in a regional hospital would typically be expected to possess or to deploy in a clinical situation. Fenn listened to this with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he was uncertain about, which was the same undivided attention he brought to everything else. Then he said, "That's not all of it." Nadia looked at him. She said, "No," he said. "What's the rest?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she was deciding whether to tell him, but because she was locating the exact words for something that had happened in a register that was partly instinctive and was therefore difficult to translate into the linear causality of a clinical account. She said, "I used his handler's name." She had seen Daniel Reyes's lips moving when the medevac team brought him in. Moving in the shallow and barely visible way that a person moves their lips when they are most of the way unconscious and are still fighting, still reaching for something to hold on to, still trying to speak to the thing they are most afraid of losing. She had read his lips in the 3 seconds she had the angle and the distance before the gurney was past her. Not every word, not perfectly. Enough. What he was saying to his dog was not a command, and was not a tactical cue, and was not any of the working language that military dogs are trained to respond to. It was his own name, spoken as a reassurance, in the specific quiet tone that a handler uses when his dog needs to know that the handler is still present, is still the anchor point, has not gone to wherever things go when they go. She had crouched down in the corner of Bay 3, and she had said that name, his given name, not his rank and title, his name, Daniel, the name his mother had given him, and that Kilo had heard thousands of times in exactly this register, in the low, even tone she had approximated from those 3 seconds of lip reading, and she had attached to it the stand-down phrase from her VA training. And then she had been very still, and she had waited to see if it was enough. It was enough. Fen was quiet for a long time after she finished, the quiet of someone who is placing something in a category that is being constructed in real time because no pre-existing category quite fits the thing being placed. He said, finally, quietly, "You lip-read him on the gurney." She said, "Yes." He said, "In 3 seconds." She said, "He was talking to his dog. I thought it might be something the dog would recognize." He said, "You thought it might be." She said, "I was fairly certain." He said, "That's a thin margin to walk through a door on." She said, "I know." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Good read." And he went back to his charts. 2 words. Fen, who operated his professional praise on an economy of scarcity because he had understood in 16 years of practice that the rarer a thing is, the more weight it carries, said good read in a room that only the 2 of them were in, and went back to his charts. Phil, who had been in the medication room doorway for portions of this exchange, said nothing. He filed what he had witnessed in the specific internal location where he kept the things he saw that he was not sure how to hold, but knew he needed to keep. He would refer to this night. In the years that followed, not by describing it directly. Phil was not a person who described things directly that he could reference obliquely, and the things that mattered most to him he referenced the most obliquely of all, but by gesturing toward it in certain conversations about what the night shift was, what it required of a person, what it meant to be in the right room at the right moment, with the right knowledge that you did not know you had been carrying until the moment you used it. At 3:15 in the morning, a liaison officer from a naval support facility arrived with a veterinary technician named Corporal Elise Huang, who was 26 years old and had spent 4 years working with military working dogs, and who moved through Bay 3 with the specific body language of someone who knew this kind of dog in this kind of state, and was not frightened of it, and was not performing a lack of fright, because the absence of performance was one of the things you learned, working with these animals, that mattered more than almost anything else. Huang examined Kilo's laceration with hands that were efficient and careful, and that Kilo submitted to with the quiet resignation of an animal who has been through field medicine and knows the difference between hands that understand what they are doing and hands that do not. Huang sutured and dressed the wound in the corner of Bay 3, which was not a veterinary facility and not cleared for this use, in which everyone in the building was collectively and tacitly agreeing to regard as close enough to those things for the purposes of the current situation, and most of them had enough experience with situations to understand that close enough is sometimes all you get and you take it. When Huang finished and stood up and looked across the bed at Nadia Torres, she said, "How did you get him to let you in here?" Nadia told her, the stand-down phrase from the VA rotation, his name in the tone she had read from his lips. Huang listened, and when Nadia was done, Huang looked at her with the particular look of someone reassessing what they are looking at, updating the category. She said, "Where did you learn that?" Nadia told her about the VA hospital in San Antonio, about a veteran whose chart name she had memorized and whose given name she had heard only from his dog's perspective, which is to say, she had heard it said in the specific way a man says his own name to his dog, which is different from every other way it gets said and is recognizable as such. About a German shepherd named Apollo, who would only eat if her handler watched her eat, and who slept with her chin on his left knee, and who, when the veteran had coded in week 3 of his stay, sudden cardiac event, no warning, the kind that makes every person in the room move very fast for several minutes, had pressed herself against the wall in the corner of the room and had not moved for 72 hours after, had refused food, had refused water, Beat had watched the door with the same focused and irrevocable attention that Kilo was bringing to Bay 3. He had come back. The resuscitation had worked, and the code team had done what they were trained to do, and the veteran had come back. And the first thing he had asked for, before he was fully conscious, before he had fully resolved the geography of where he was and what had happened, was his dog. They had brought Apollo in, and she had walked to his left side and laid down and put her chin on his knee, and he had put his hand on her back, and his breathing had steadied in a way that the monitor confirmed, which was the kind of datum that a nursing student on rotation files, not in the clinical compartment of her mind, but somewhere deeper and more durable. Use in the place where the things live that change how you see the work you have chosen. Nadia said, "The handler taught me some things, how to approach her, some of what she knew. He didn't teach me formally. He just let me be in the room, and I watched." Huang was quiet for a moment. She said, "You stayed in that room." Not a question. Nadia said, "Whenever I could." Huang looked at her for another moment. She said, "Good." Just that word. And she went back to her work. At 3:40 in the morning, Nadia Torres finished her end-of-shift documentation, and she stood up from the nurse's station, and she carried her cold coffee to Bay 3, and she sat down on the floor. Not near the bed. In the corner, on the tile floor, and with her back to the wall, and her knees up and the cold coffee in both hands, and nothing particular being asked of the room or of the dog, or of the 11 minutes that remained of her shift. She did not look at Kilo. She did not speak. She was present without demanding anything from the room in return for her presence, which was a skill she had practiced in a VA hospital in San Antonio years ago, and had not known she was practicing until she found herself doing it again in a different room, in a different building, in a different November, and it was still the same skill, still the same quality of staying, still the same willingness to be in a room, because the room needed someone in it, and she was the one who understood that. Kilo looked at her for a long time from across the bay. After approximately 4 minutes, Phil had come to check vitals in Bay 4 and had looked through the window and had pulled out his phone and timed it, because Phil timed things, because numbers were the way Phil made the ineffable into something he could carry. Kilo stood, not in the forward-weighted stance of assessment, slowly, with the deliberateness of an animal that has made a decision and is acting on it. He crossed the room at a walk, and he stood beside where Nadia was sitting on the floor, and he smelled her hands, first the right and then the left, with the thoroughness of a working dog conducting a comprehensive olfactory inventory of a person he has already decided to trust, but whose parameters he is updating in real time. Then he lowered himself to the floor beside her. Not touching. 8 inches of space. The precise distance of an animal that is choosing proximity without surrendering the choice, that's allowing closeness without conceding the gap, that is trusting while keeping the form of the decision visible. He put his chin on the tile. And he exhaled. The long, slow exhale through the nose, the specific sound and quality of an animal releasing a state of readiness that it has maintained for so long that the releasing of it is itself an act of will, a choice rather than a collapse, a deliberate setting down of something that has been carried deliberately and has become very heavy over 31 hours, and 2 cardiac arrests, and a rooftop landing, and a room full of strangers with bright lights and unfamiliar smells, and no signal that any of them could be trusted. Here he put his chin on the tile of Bay 3 at 3:44 in the morning, and he exhaled, and he closed his eyes. Nadia Torres sat on the floor of Bay 3 with her cold coffee in her lap, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she let him sleep. Phil found her there at 4:10 when he came to check on the adjacent bay and looked through the hallway window as he was passing. He stood at the glass for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking at a 31-year-old nurse sitting on a hospital floor at 4 in the morning with a dog asleep 8 inches from her side, and a cold cup of coffee that she had never drunk in both hands, and her face doing nothing in particular, just present, just there, just occupying the room the way she had been practicing occupying rooms since San Antonio. Phil did not knock. No, he made a note in his internal ledger that no one else had access to, but that was the most accurate record of the night shift that St. Agatha Regional Medical Center possessed, and he moved on to Bay 4, and he let them be. Daniel Reyes was moved to the ICU at 1:15 and was transferred to a military medical facility on day 11. Before he left on day 7, when he was awake and sitting up in the late afternoon November light of the ICU, he and Nadia talked. He said, "You're the one who talked to my dog." She said yes. He asked what she said. She told him. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "That man saved my dog's life," meaning the veteran in San Antonio who had let her stay in the room and had said his own name in the way he said it and had taught her things he did not know he was teaching. She said he didn't know he was doing it. Reyes said they never do. That's how it works. 3 days after the transfer, a package arrived at the nurse's station addressed to Night Shift Bay 3. Phil signed for it. Inside was a challenge coin, gold, worn at the edges, in the way of things that have been carried and held and been close to a person's body through enough things that the edges have softened with contact. And a note. 3 sentences. Phil called Nadia at 2 in the afternoon and read her the note over the phone. The 3rd sentence was 5 words. "The dog slept because you stayed." Nadia Torres sat in her kitchen in the pale November afternoon and held the phone and was quiet for a while. And outside the light was going the way November light goes, pulling back from the day earlier than you expect it to, leaving you with what you have. What you take from this story, past the dog and the standoff and the trauma bay and the specific combination of knowledge and attention that opened a door that 5 other people could not open, past all of the dramatic architecture of it, is this. The most important thing Nadia Torres brought into Bay 3 on a Tuesday night in November was not bravery and was not superior technical training and was not a quality of character available only to certain rare people. It was a choice she had made 4 years earlier, and many times after that, to stay in a room when leaving was the easier option, to pay attention when looking away would have been defensible, to absorb what a room contained and to trust that it might matter someday in a way she could not predict. That choice, repeated, ordinary, unavailable to any person who makes it, was the whole preparation. That was all of it. Every person in that hallway had looked through the window at Kilo. Every person had understood that something was wrong and that the situation was beyond the available protocols. 5 of them had opened the door and 5 of them had retreated, for reasons that were reasonable and defensible, and that did not reflect any failure on their part. Nadia walked in and stayed because she carried something specific that the room needed, and she carried it because she had chosen to be in a room in San Antonio that was not hers to be in, years ago when a German Shepherd was in crisis and a veteran needed someone to stay with him, and the someone the room needed turned out to be her. Subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with someone who works nights, who works emergency medicine, who works any caregiving role, who has ever stood at a hallway window and felt the pull of the room on the other side and either walked in or kept walking. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Tell me about the room you stayed in past the point where staying was required. This community is built from those stories, from the people who stayed when they did not have to, and I want to know all of you. Now, here is what this story tells us at the level of clinical and professional practice, because there is real and important education embedded in it for anyone who works in medicine or emergency services or veterinary medicine or any field where working animals and their handlers appear in crisis situations. Military working dogs are trained to bond with their handlers through a combination of operant conditioning and what behavioral researchers have come to describe as a secure attachment relationship, a framework borrowed from human developmental psychology that turns out to apply with significant accuracy to handler-dog partnerships forged over years of shared high-stress operational experience. The implications of this bond for emergency medicine are underappreciated and in many cases entirely unaddressed by clinical training. When a handler is critically injured and the dog is present, the dog's threat assessment system does not turn off. It redirects. The animal defaults to the behavioral program it has been trained to adopt when threat is detected, and the handler cannot provide commands, hold position, maintain perimeter. Wait for a recognized safe signal. That signal is not a generic calming input. It is not a soft voice in the abstract or a slow approach in the abstract or the absence of sudden movements in the abstract. It is specific. It is the handler's language, the handler's cues, the handler's name, and the handler's register. A stranger deploying that language correctly, in the right tone and the right sequence, can approximate enough of the signal to gain conditional access. But only if the stranger has had prior specific exposure to that language, and only if they retain the presence of mind to use it under conditions that most people find genuinely disabling for clear thought. Nadia Torres had the language because she stayed in a room. She had the presence of mind because staying in rooms had trained it into her over time, had built the capacity for clear thinking in frightening situations by putting her in frightening situations and requiring her to stay present in them rather than retreat. There is no shortcut to this. There is no protocol that generates it. There is only the practice of sustained attention, of choosing repeatedly to be in the room when you could be somewhere else, of absorbing what rooms contain and trusting that you might need it someday in ways you cannot predict and for reasons you cannot foresee. For anyone in emergency medicine or emergency services who has encountered or may encounter a patient with a working animal in crisis, the military dog, the psychiatric service dog who will not leave the patient's side, the search and rescue dog who is injured alongside its handler, and the therapy animal in a situation that has exceeded its training, carry this forward. The animal is not a complication. The animal is information. The animal's behavior is telling you something about the patient that the patient cannot tell you themselves, and it is telling you that something with a precision and completeness that no verbal report could match. Stay in that information. Read it. Use it. The language is accessible if you have put yourself in the position to learn it, and putting yourself in that position is a choice that is always available. And to everyone watching who has never worked a night shift, who has never been in a trauma bay, who has never sat on a tile floor at 4 a.m. with a cold cup of coffee and a sleeping dog beside them, the lesson is the same lesson. Stay in the room, whatever your room is. Whatever the thing is that you keep walking past because the door's not technically yours to open and the situation is not technically yours to manage and there are people who are supposed to handle it. Look through the window. And if you understand what is inside, and if you carry something that the room needs, even something you have been carrying for years without knowing it was for this specific moment, walk through the door. It will be enough. It is almost always enough. And on the night it isn't, you learn what you need to know for the next time, and you go back, and you try again. The tones will drop. The next shift will begin. Somewhere right now, a night shift nurse is walking toward a room that nobody else wanted to enter, carrying knowledge they did not know they possessed from a place they would not describe as a classroom. They are staying in the room. They are learning the language. They are crouching down in the corner and saying someone's name in the tone that might be the right tone and waiting to see if it is enough. The dog slept because she stayed. That's the whole story. Stay in the room. There's a particular quality to a firehouse kitchen at 2 a.m. that has no civilian equivalent. And there's a particular quality to a hospital break room at 2 a.m. that is its closest analog. The fluorescent light going slightly harsh in the way fluorescent light goes harsh at that hour. The coffee that has been sitting in the pot for 90 minutes and has developed a character. The sound of people who have been awake since before yesterday, fully processing at a rate that is slower than it would be at noon, and honest in a way that noon does not always permit. This is where the night shift lives. In those 2 a.m. hours, in the break room between the calls, between the patients, in the 20 minutes of horizontal time that the schedule provides and the body insists upon. And this is where the story of Bay 3 lived for several weeks after it happened, told and retold in the particular oral tradition of the overnight, the story acquiring detail with each telling and losing detail with each telling and arriving, eventually, at a shape that was truer than any single account of it, because it had been processed through the collective understanding of people who understood what it meant. What it meant, or in the break room at 2 a.m, was several different things to several different people. To Keegan, it meant something about the limits of protocol, the places where the written procedure ends, and the human being inside the clinician has to make a decision about what the room actually needs. To Calloway, it meant something about humility, about the specific and uncomfortable lesson that the most experienced person in a room is not always the person with the most formal experience, that competence can arrive from unexpected directions, and you had better be paying attention or you will miss it. To Phil, it meant something he did not articulate to anyone, something he kept in the ledger, something that would surface years later in a conversation with a nursing student doing a rotation at St. To Agatha, who asked him what made a great night shift nurse, and he would tell her the story of Bay 3 without naming any names, would describe a dog in a corner and a door that 5 people had not been able to open and 1 person had. And he would say, the difference was a room in San Antonio that she chose to stay in, and the nursing student would write it in her notes as though it were advice about professional development, which it was, but it was also something else. What it meant to Nadia Torres was the most complicated and the least articulated. She did not talk about it. This was not secretiveness. She was not a secretive person. It was more that the thing the story meant to her was not a thing that had words yet, that was still sitting in the region of the chest where things live before they become language. And forcing it into language before it was ready would have diminished it in some way she could not explain. What she knew was that something had come full circle in Bay 3, something that had begun in a hospital room in San Antonio, with a man she had never fully known, and a dog named Apollo, and a choice to stay in a room that was not hers to stay in. What she knew was that knowledge is not inert, that it lives in you and waits and is never wasted, even when it seems to have no application, even when years pass and the specific room where you acquired it recedes into the middle distance of memory. What she knew, sitting on her kitchen floor with the challenge coin in her hand and the November light going away, was that she was a link in a chain that she had not known she was part of until she was in the middle of it. The veteran in San Antonio, whose name she had known only from a chart and whose given name she had heard only in the way a man speaks it to his dog, had carried something into the hospital from the places he had been, and he had given it, without knowing he was giving it, to a nursing student who chose to stay in his room. And that nursing student had carried it for 4 years and had given it, without knowing when or how or to whom she would give it, to a man in a trauma bay in November, and to his dog. And the man and the dog were going to carry it forward into whatever came next for them, into the program for working dogs with combat trauma, into the recovery, into the life after the recovery. The chain was longer than she could see from where she was standing. It was always longer than any of us can see from where we are standing. We are always in the middle of it. This is the knowledge that the night shift carries and does not often speak of, because the night shift is not given to sentiment in the abstract and prefers its truths concrete and specific. But the truth is there, underneath the specifics, underneath the challenge coin and the cold coffee and the 62-pound dog on the tile floor. We are all of us in the middle of a chain we cannot fully see. The thing you learn by staying in a room will be given to someone else by staying in the room. The room you stayed in is still teaching you. The room you will stay in has not arrived yet. In the days after Daniel Reyes was transferred, the hospital returned to itself, which is what hospitals do, which is what the night shift does, which is what every sustained emergency does when the emergency resolves. It folds back into the ordinary resumes its pressure. The next shift begins and brings its own problems and its own demands and its own moments that will require the specific thing that only one person in the building is carrying. Keegan picked up an extra shift on the south wing. Calloway rotated to cardiology for his next block. Phil continued to be Phil, which was a comprehensive and adequate description. Nadia Torres went back to Bay 7 and Bay 4 and Bay 11, went back to the cold coffee and the end-of-shift charting and the particular rhythm of the overnight that she had built her professional life inside of, and that suited her in the way that some environments suit some people, not because they are comfortable. Because they are not comfortable, but because they are honest, because what is at stake in them is always clear, because the people in them are always fully present by necessity, because there is no room for anything less than full presence in a trauma bay at 3 in the morning. She did not think about Bay 3 constantly. The night shift does not allow for constant thinking about any one thing. The next patient arrives. The next call comes. The next room requires whatever it requires. But Bay 3 was there the way significant experiences are there, not in the foreground, but in the place behind the foreground where everything you carry lives, available when you need it, not demanding anything of you in the meantime. And the challenge coin was in her pocket, because she had put it there the morning Phil called, and she had not taken it out since, and she did not take it out to look at it or think about it. But she knew it was there, the particular small weight of something that someone carried through enough to have its edges softened, and she was carrying it now through her own things, and someday its edges would be a little softer, and that seemed right. Corporal Elise Huang sent a brief clinical update through the liaison officer at the end of month 1. Kilo was responding well to the transition program. His sleep patterns were regularizing, his appetite had stabilized. He was assessed as making progress in the gradual reintroduction to operational stimuli that was the clinical methodology of the program. A slow and careful reacquaintance with the sounds and smells and demands of work without the trauma response that had been fused to them. The update noted that the handler's recovery was proceeding in parallel and that the handler-dog bond was assessed as intact and functional, which was the clinical language for something that was not clinical, which was, they still had each other, and they were both going to be all right. Nadia read the update twice. She filed it in the specific internal location where she kept the things she needed to keep. She went back to work. The tones dropped that night at 0217 for a motor vehicle accident on Route 11 with injuries, multiple patients, and the night shift moved in the way the night shift moves when the tones drop, which is all at once and without hesitation. The choreography of people who have done this enough times that their bodies know the sequence before their minds have caught up. Bay 3 received a 37-year-old male with blunt abdominal trauma and a fractured pelvis. And Bay 3 was a room like any other room on a night like any other night, and the work was the work, and the work continued. This is the ending. Not a resolution, but a continuation. The tones will drop again. They always do. And when they do, there will be someone in the building who is carrying something they did not know they were carrying, from a room they do not think of as a classroom, from a choice they made years ago to stay somewhere when leaving was easier. And the room in front of them will need exactly that thing, and they will walk through the door. Stay in the room. This is all the advice I have for you. Stay in the room. There is one more thing that happened that is not in any document and was not witnessed by anyone on the night shift, or anyone in hospital administration, or anyone who filed a report, and it matters enough that this story is incomplete without it. On the morning of day 4, at approximately 6:15, which is the hour when night shifts end and the morning light is doing what it does in November, which is arriving reluctantly in gray, Nadia Torres was in the ICU corridor doing the final portions of her handoff when she heard from behind the closed door of Daniel Reyes's room a sound she had not heard in the entire 3.5 days he had been on the floor. She stopped. She stood in the corridor with her handoff notes in her hand, and she listened. The sound was low and steady, and it took her a moment to identify it, because it was not a sound she associated with this building or this floor or this kind of patient. It was a dog, breathing slowly in the rhythm of deep sleep, the specific unguarded sound of an animal that has allowed itself completely and without reservation to be unconscious. No part sleep, no one ear up, no the peripheral assessment continues in standby. Sleep, full and real and the kind that repairs things. She could hear it through the door. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The handoff notes were in her hand. The day shift was arriving in 1s and 2s down the corridor, bringing the morning with them, the different kind of noise and light and pace that day shift brings, the world returning to its daytime operating temperature. She stood in the corridor, and she listened to a dog sleep through a closed door, and she thought about a German shepherd in San Antonio named Apollo, who had not slept for 72 hours, who had pressed herself against a wall and watched a door and refused food and refused water, and waited. And about the morning 3 days later when Apollo had laid her chin on a man's knee and her breathing had steadied, and then, finally, her eyes had closed. She had not been in the room for that. She had heard about it from the day shift nurse, had heard it described in the brief practical language of a clinical report. Patient continues to improve, therapeutic animal present, vital stable, and had carried it forward as a fact without fully feeling it as the thing it was. She felt it now, standing in a corridor in a different building in a different November, with a different dog on the other side of a different door. She felt it the way you feel things that have waited for you, that required the right moment and the right distance from the original experience, before they could be fully received. She felt it, and she did not say anything, and she did not go into the room, and she went and finished her handoff, and she went home, and she drove through the gray November morning with the heater on and the radio off, and she thought about chains you cannot see the full length of, and about the rooms you stay in that stay with you, and about a challenge coin in her jacket pocket with softened edges that had been somewhere before it came to her and would go somewhere after. And she was very tired in the way of the end of a long shift, and she was also fine. It is always enough until the night it isn't, and then you go back and you try again. The dog slept. She stayed. The chain continues. Before I let you go, and this is the educational close that this story has earned, the thing you should carry forward into wherever you are going after this video, I want to name the specific medical and behavioral science underneath what happened in Bay 3, because it is real, and it matters, and it has applications beyond one nurse and one dog on one Tuesday night in November. Working dogs bonded to handlers through the specific structure of military working dog partnerships, handler-exclusive feeding, handler-exclusive play. A handler-led operational work over years of shared high-stress experience develop a neuroendocrine profile that is measurably different from other dogs. Research conducted at several universities studying handler-dog physiological synchrony has documented what handlers have known empirically for as long as military working dogs have existed. The dog's stress hormone profile tracks the handler's stress hormone profile with a lag of approximately 15 to 30 minutes, which means the dog's body is responding to what the handler's body is doing before the handler's behavior changes in any way that observers can perceive. The dog smells the fear before the person shows the fear. The dog smells the pain before the pain is reported. The dog smells the cardiac event, the specific hormonal and metabolic shift of acute cardiac distress, before the monitor alarms. This is not metaphor. This is biochemistry. When the handler is incapacitated and cannot communicate, the dog's nervous system is running without its primary regulatory input. The dog's cortisol is elevated. The dog's threat assessment is active and persistent. The dog is in a sustained state of readiness that is physiologically extremely costly, the kind of sustained arousal that in humans we call hypervigilance and recognize as a feature of acute stress response in chronic trauma. The dog cannot turn it off by choice. The dog can only turn it off when it receives the signal that its specific nervous system has been trained to recognize as safe, which is the handler's signal, which is specific and idiosyncratic to that handler-dog partnership. What Nadia gave Kylo was an approximation of that signal. It was imperfect. She was not the handler, and she did not have full access to the handler's language, and she was working from 3 seconds of lip reading and 4 years of prior knowledge and the specific quality of her own presence in the room. But it was close enough. The nervous system, under the conditions of extreme and prolonged stress, is less precise about the edges of what counts as the signal than it is under normal conditions, because under extreme conditions, precision costs resources that the system does not have available. Close enough, in the right register, from a person whose own nervous system was broadcasting something that was not fear and was not aggression and was not the performed version of either of those things. Close enough mattered. It worked. This is the clinical lesson. The dog's behavior in Bay 3 was not a behavioral problem with a behavioral solution. It was a physiological state with a physiological resolution. The resolution required a specific input. The specific input was available in that building at that hour only because one person had stayed in a room 4 years earlier. And if that person had not stayed, if she had walked past instead of through, the resolution would have required 45 minutes and animal control. And Daniel Reyes's blood pressure would have continued doing the things it was doing for 45 minutes longer. And the outcome would have been different in ways that cannot be precisely calculated, but can be approximately understood. This is also the human lesson, which does not require clinical translation. You do not know what you are carrying until the moment you need to use it. You do not know which room you stayed in that mattered until the room that needs it arrives. The practice is simply this: stay in rooms, pay attention to what they contain, trust that it is accumulating somewhere inside you and will be available when the moment requires it, even if you cannot see the moment from here. You are always in the middle of a chain you cannot see the full length of. Stay in it. Keep carrying what you carry. It will be enough. If this story reached you tonight, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what shift you work. Tell me the room you stayed in. I am building a community here of people who understand what it means to stay, and I want to know you. Like this video and share it with someone who needed to hear it. The next story is coming. The tones will drop again. The dog slept because she stayed. Carry that with you. Good night. One last thing. Because this channel exists at the intersection of people who run toward things and people who study why they do, and because the story of Bay 3 has a thread in it that I want to name before we close. The challenge coin that arrived at St. Agatha's nurses' station 3 days after Daniel Reyes's transfer is a military tradition with a history that goes back at least a century, in various forms, in various branches of service, across various conflicts. The specific origin stories are disputed and probably apocryphal in the way that military traditions often are. The stories that explain where a custom came from are almost always simpler and neater than the actual origin, because traditions do not arise from single moments. They arise from a practice that accumulates meaning over time until the meaning is so dense that it requires a physical object to carry it. A coin. Something that fits in a pocket and has weight. Something you can hold. The tradition of presenting a challenge coin to someone who has performed an act of significance is, at its core, the tradition of saying, "I saw what you did, and I want you to carry it, and I want you to know that I will carry it too." And the carrying is the acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement is the thing that matters. Because the act you performed would have happened without witnesses and without any official recognition, and you did it anyway. And that is the point. And this coin is the proof that someone knows. Nadia Torres carried the coin in her pocket through the remainder of November and through December and into the new year, where it became one of the objects that accumulates in a life the way certain objects do, the ones that have too much weight to lose track of, that migrate between jacket pockets and desk drawers and the specific cup on the kitchen counter where important small things live. She did not display it. She did not tell most people about it. It was hers, and its edges softened a little more each month from the contact, and it was enough. This is what the night shift gives and does not give back. It gives you the rooms and the names and the things you carried through them. It gives you the knowledge of what you were capable of on the night when capability was required, and you had not yet been told you had it. It gives you the specific and undeserved blessing of being the right person in the right room at the right moment. Undeserved because you did not plan for it and could not have planned for it, but earned because you made the 1,000 small choices that put you in that room with that knowledge in that particular configuration. The night shift does not give you recognition, mostly. It does not give you regular sleep or regular meals or the social schedule that other people have, or the kind of tiredness that rest fully resolves. It gives you the rooms, and the rooms are enough. Stay in the room. The dog slept because she stayed. Good night.